This is Siena, a wonderfully preserved medieval city in central Italy. At its heyday, around 1300, it was one of the most civilized and prosperous places in Europe. Siena and the other Italian city-states of its time, like Florence, can stand as a new beginning in our story of Western art. Hitherto, the old medieval worldview had, put simply, divided the classes of society into the aristocracy at the top, the church, and the laboring peasantry at the bottom. But in places like this, we see for the first time in European history a new class, conscious of its own identity, the merchants. These cities were no longer controlled by feudal lords. They were republics. Here in Siena, several thousand citizens were eligible for election to the governing bodies, which met down there in the Palazzo Pubblico. And in the Palazzo, there is a fresco painted in the 1340s, which encapsulates their faith in the secular arts of government, in the moderating power of reason in human society. It's called The Effects of Good Government. This marvelous fresco, painted by Ambrogio Lorenzetti, was the first panoramic landscape on this scale in Western art. The peasants bringing their produce from the countryside, the merchants going about their business, the elegant ladies of leisure, all are fused into an idealized image of the well-governed city-state. Eight years later, the Black Death devastated Siena. It killed the artist Lorenzetti and half the population of Europe. It was the greatest catastrophe in the modern history of the West. But surprisingly, for some regions, the plague was a springboard for economic growth. For the survivors, there were new opportunities. Florence recovered particularly quickly. By 1400, this was the city-state that dominated central Italy. The bankers and textile merchants were expanding their trading empires all over Europe. Over the next 100 years, an extraordinary interaction took place in Florence. The innovations of artists and architects, the excitement of rediscovering classical achievements, and the patronage of a wealthy commercial class. These key elements brought about a series of artistic and intellectual breakthroughs that came to be known as the Renaissance, literally the rebirth of learning and culture. In the church of Santa Croce, a series of frescoes painted around 1320 were to have a revolutionary effect on Florentine painting. Here, the great merchant families competed with one another to commission the leading artists to decorate their chapels. In the chapel of the Bardi family, Professor John White of University College London describes how these medieval images came to life.
This is a Franciscan church, and the Franciscans were the passionate preachers of the late medieval world. They used their words to tug at the emotions of the faithful, rich and poor alike. And at the same time, the painters increasingly tried to bring the Gospels and the stories of the saints to life before their very eyes. At first, as you can see in this late 13th century St. Francis altarpiece, they did it with stiff, imposing figures and with bright, doll-like symbolic scenes and images. And here next door, in a much ruined fresco, I'm afraid, painted probably only 30 or 40 years later, you can see the revolution represented by the art of Giotto, the great contemporary of the poet Dante. Here is a new, soft, warm reality, a new humanity and pathos, a new ability to take the faithful back and make them feel that they were actually there and filled with love for this loving saint whose love of Christ and love of life and of the beauties of the world wrought a transformation in the spiritual life of Europe. Giotto's frescoes gave a new sense of weight to the human body, a new sense of urgency to narrative painting. They became an academy for later Italian artists. Raphael and Michelangelo came here to learn from such dramatic images as this, in which St. Francis receives the wounds of Christ upon his hands and feet.
Giotto's frescoes brought him immortality and undying fame to the chapel of the Bardi. They and families like them were moneylenders to the popes and kings of Europe. They were the pioneers of the new world of international finance, and the coinage of Florence, the gold florin, became the common currency of Christendom. Even John the Baptist, the saint of the desert and the enemy of luxury, is depicted surrounded by gold florins on the cover of a book containing the rules of the coin makers. But if the prosperity of Florence was owed to the bankers, the rebirth of its intellectual energy came from a rediscovery of classical culture.
Without ever leaving Santa Croce, we can move into the world of the Renaissance with this tomb of Leonardo Bruni, longtime Chancellor of Florence, who died in 1444. This was the Florence of the humanists, the students of the classics, of the knowledge and the wisdom of the ancient world. They went right back to the origins of Western thought in the great Greek philosophers. He also wrote a history of Florence, starting with Roman times. And in this great work, he put historical writing also onto a new footing, both in terms of its literary content and its scholarly underpinning. And there he lies, his history on his breast, surrounded by a wealth of classical detail, his bier supported by the Roman eagles, and his hope of heaven in the roundel of the Virgin and Child above his head. This monument in itself is a wordless combination of the Christian and the classical. This is the Pantheon, the most perfectly preserved temple of ancient Rome. Scholars like Bruni and the artists of Renaissance Florence had a passionate love affair with antiquity. The humanists recovered and translated the texts. The artists studied the statues and the frescoes. But they were not simply copying the achievements of the ancient world, they were transforming them. This Renaissance design for an ideal city uses classical architecture to create a perfect environment based upon reason and order. And in perhaps the most famous image of man by a Renaissance artist, Leonardo da Vinci is illustrating the Roman author Vitruvius. Man, in his ideal proportions, is the measure of all things. Out of their preoccupation with classical harmony and proportion, Renaissance artists created these new images of man and woman.
Inside the Palazzo Vecchio, the 5,000 or so Florentines who had the right to vote would meet, summoned by the bell in times of crisis. They were the members of the influential guilds and represented the craftsmen and the most economically important activities. Sculptors and stoneworkers, textiles, metal workers, masons and builders, lawyers and solicitors. The engine driving the art of Florence at the beginning of the 15th century was competition between the guilds and competition between the artists commissioned by them. The Armourers' Guild paid for this powerful, alert image of their patron saint, St. George by Donatello. Roman art transformed into a vision of Christian courage. The Bankers' Guild paid for Ghiberti's expensive bronze statue of St. Matthew, the patron saint of money changers. These reliefs are the two front runners for the most famous of all Florentine competitions, held in 1401 to decide the commission for new bronze doors for the baptistry. The subject is the prophet Abraham, about to sacrifice his son Isaac, and this entry by the young Brunelleschi emphasizes the violence of the act. Abraham holds Isaac by the throat to plunge the knife in. The angel seizes Abraham's wrist in a dramatic last-minute intervention. But Lorenzo Ghiberti won the competition with this relief, immediately acknowledged as an exhibition of unrivaled craftsmanship. The nude figure of Isaac is based on classical models. This is a triumph of the goldsmith's craft, embodying lessons learned from antique statuary and combining that with a Gothic grace learned from the art of Northern Europe. Florence is still a thriving centre for the goldsmith's art. This is the studio of Signor Giorgio Chileri at the south end of the Ponte Vecchio, and he works here as a master with his apprentice craftsmen. Now, a whole generation of famous Florentine artists, Ghiberti, Brunelleschi, Donatello, began work in studios not unlike this, working on just such meticulous and minute creations before moving on in their careers to their monumental works of art. In such an environment where the skill of the craftsman is so highly prized, it was inevitable, perhaps, that their status should rise. Inevitable, too, that the most brilliant of them, men like Brunelleschi and Donatello, should resent the restrictions which the craft guilds could place on them, and resent, too, the implication that somehow their work was menial, a mechanical craft. And so, increasingly during this century, such artists came to see themselves as the equals of their patrons. No longer humble, anonymous craftsmen, but self-confident, ambitious, intellectual practitioners of the liberal arts, famous beyond their own city. Brunelleschi visited Rome after his unsuccessful submission for the baptistry doors competition. There he saw a great city in a state of decay. The sheer scale of the Roman ruins and the building techniques he analyzed provided inspiration for the greatest problem of structural engineering in Italy: how to complete the cathedral being built in Florence.
In this great space, we are surrounded by a Gothic architecture ripe for the Renaissance. The flat surfaces of the walls, the crisp, plainer detailing of the piers with their sharp angles, not a curve, not a rounded form in sight. It all looks so precise and so completely pre-planned. And yet, if we had stood here half a century after they began to build this building, we would have seen something very different. Behind me there, you would still have seen the medieval houses within the existing foundations. And then, as the piers went up, they were still arguing about how high they should be. When they came to those capitals, they had a competition about their precise form. They had plaster, wooden, stone models. And when all that was done, and they were still arguing about the precise dimensions of the building, they went on for 50 years, and not a man in Italy or Europe, let alone in Florence, would have had the foggiest idea of how they could ever put a dome over that great crossing that you see behind me there.
In 1417, a conference of architects was summoned from all over Italy to discuss the problem of how to construct the dome. And eventually, Brunelleschi was entrusted with the commission.
Standing here and looking down into the space, this 150-foot wide octagonal crossing, we can get some idea, at least, of what it was for Brunelleschi to be faced by the greatest architectural and engineering challenge which had confronted any Italian architect since the distant days of antiquity. It was quite impossible to fill this space with a forest of timber, and even if it had been, it would never have supported itself, let alone the weight of the cupola during its construction. So Brunelleschi's primary problem and his first triumph was to devise a form of scaffolding which started not at the ground, but 40 feet above our heads at the top of the drum. And then his second was to build the cupola in such a way that it was self-supporting in the course of its construction. And this is an important part of Brunelleschi's structural solution: herringbone brickwork. Instead of simply laying rows of bricks horizontally, some of them were laid vertically to provide a kind of internal skeleton, locking the horizontal rings of brickwork into place whilst the mortar was setting. Enormous scale involves enormous weight, and Brunelleschi's masterstroke in building his cupola was to devise a double shell, built first of stone and then of brick to lighten it still further. We are standing in one of the passageways between these two shells, and that, of course, solved his whole problem of access for his building materials and, of course, for subsequent maintenance, whilst the great ribs which bind the inner and the outer shells together ensure its strength and structural stability. When we come out into the light, out of the dark passages and tunnels of the dome, we are surrounded by the classic forms of Brunelleschi's lantern. As we look down, we can immediately understand exactly what his great contemporary and fellow architect Alberti meant when he spoke of this magnificent cupola rising above the skies, ample enough to encompass in its shadow all the people of Tuscany.
In 1419, Brunelleschi had begun the Hospital of the Innocenti. It was the first orphanage in Europe to be funded by public donations, and the architecture is a delicate blending of the Roman and the Romanesque. It was Brunelleschi's architecture which the painter Fra Angelico depicted in his fresco of the Annunciation, which awaits you at the top of the stairs of the monastery of San Marco. Fra Angelico lived and worked here, decorating the monastery with scenes from the New Testament. Scenes striking for their simplicity and serenity. Inside the cells, the world seems to retreat, leaving a single image suspended like a spiritual vision. The buildings and frescoes of San Marco were paid for by one of the wealthiest Florentine bankers, Cosimo de' Medici, whose family symbol adorns the walls, and who would retreat from the pressures of business into his personal cell within the monastery. Fra Angelico decorated Cosimo's cell with the adoration of the Magi, the moment in the story of Christ that these patrician bankers identified with. "30 years later, Botticelli painted the same scene for the same patrons, but now the powerful patrician families have taken over the religious stage. Cosimo the Elder is portrayed kneeling before the Madonna, while his grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, swaggers on one side. Every face in this painting is a portrait from the Medici court circle, including Botticelli himself. In another Botticelli portrait, a medallion of Cosimo the Elder is held by a fashionable young man. Botticelli's painting epitomizes the shift in patronage during the second half of the 15th century, away from the world of public competition into the private space of the Florentine palazzo. The patrician families of Florence erected monuments to their own prestige in the palazzi of the 15th century. Palazzo Rucellai by the architect Alberti was admired for its classical detail and the elegance of its proportions. More magnificent was the palace designed for Cosimo de' Medici. This was not simply a home, but the center of a vast banking empire. Massive doors and rough rusticated masonry on the ground floor, increasingly smoother stonework above, created a style that was to be imitated by palaces and banks in Europe and America for the next 500 years. The Medici created an elegant society where artists and scholars studied astrology and mythology, reviving antiquity for their private pleasure. Cosimo commissioned the humanist Ficino to translate the works of Plato, and out of this intellectual climate came the paintings of Botticelli, combining the sensuality of pagan mythology with themes and images from Christian art. In his painting of the Primavera, Zephyrus, the wind god, enters the scene and seizes the wood nymph Chloris, whose mouth issues flowers as she is transformed into Flora, the goddess of spring. In the center stands a figure who resembles both the Christian Madonna and Venus, the goddess of love, and who directs the dance of the three graces. Naked Venus, seen here in Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, symbolized divine love. This was a nude based on classical forms, which also suggests a baptism and a rebirth. In Renaissance Florence, the nude again became the focus of artistic effort. Donatello's David, probably commissioned by the Medici, is a masterpiece of technical virtuosity and erotic suggestion. But it was more than that. Significantly, Donatello depicted David not as a king, but as a boy who slew a giant, an enduring image of the small city-state that withstood its powerful enemies. Looking over the rooftops and domes of the city, we can try to take an overview of that extraordinary period of artistic outpouring. It was, after all, a city whose population never even reached 100,000, continually riven by faction and strife, and yet which produced some of the greatest figures in the history of Western culture, from Giotto and Dante to Michelangelo and Leonardo. With all of them, it is the freshness of their thought, their willingness to experiment, their modernity, which impresses us today. But there is another side to the story. Civilized human life depends not only on modernity, but on a healthy assimilation of the past, both critical and imaginative. The Middle Ages had proved incapable of doing that. But here, in the Florentine Renaissance, we can see the reintegration of the classical worldview into modern life. Not merely their learning, but their pagan humanism and their pantheism with its incomparably rich mythological themes, which, as we now understand, contain such profound psychological insights. What we see here in Florence is what they made of that tradition, just as this is what we are making of them. But its continued reinterpretation is a necessity for the West if it is to understand its own cultural tradition.
you.